Good morning, and welcome to Finanspanelen this beautiful morning. It's much easier to do this in May than in November, isn't it? Going up early in the morning to go to a seminar. My name is Pehr Wissén. I work at the Swedish House of Finance at the Stockholm School of Economics. And together with SNS, we organize this seminar series called Finanspanelen. And today we will debate Brexit. And in order to do that, we have invited Mr. Jeremy Browne, who was here, I think it was September last year. It wasn't very long ago, but things are moving fast in when it comes to Brexit and the negotiations and everything. So we are very happy that you agreed to come here again. Mr. Browne is special representative for the City of London Corporation in the European Union and has been a member of Parliament and a Foreign Office and Home Office Minister. So, and I stress that we are here to debate, not primarily to listen and learn, though Mr. Browne has promised to give us a 15-20 minute or so introduction to the state of things when it comes to Brexit. And then we haven't had much public debate in Sweden about Sweden and sort of what should Sweden do when we lose one of our best friends in the EU workings. And so we have invited Jens Henriksson, CEO of Folksam, an old friend of Finanspanelen. You've been here before, and as you know, Jens has been at the Ministry of Finance, at Nasdaq, at IMF, at lots of places, and a very broad experience. And Jens will comment for 10 minutes or so after. And then we will end at 9 o'clock today. So I very much encourage you to ask questions or voice your opinion, say what you feel, whatever, after the presentations. So please, Jeremy Browne, the floor is yours.
So I was so busy listening to you, I forgot to turn my microphone on. Good morning, everybody. I'm also sorry, I've got a slight cold, so I hope I can be understood by all of you. I will keep it quite short, because I think it'd be more interesting to have a conversation, a debate. But maybe it'd be helpful for me to set the context. And thank you all for coming here quite early in the morning. I visited all 28 member states of the EU last year. And I promise I don't say this at every member state, but this is one of my favourite ones to be in. Genuinely, I had a really good time when I came to Stockholm last September, and it's nice to be here again. Since then, on this big subject for us, Brexit, it's pretty much all I talk about. What has happened? Well, the British government has made its position formally known. So Theresa May, our still reasonably new Prime Minister, has laid out the position as she sees it, the crucial dimension of which is her saying that she does not aspire to have Britain within the single market. So the big message that was relayed by Angela Merkel and Jean-Claude Juncker and François Hollande and others is the four freedoms are indivisible. You cannot be in the single market and cherry pick and have your cake and eat it and all of the other expressions they used without accepting the four freedoms. They are inviolable, they are indivisible. And it was anticipated there would be quite a long discussion about whether Britain would be able to be in the single market on special terms. Theresa May took a very different approach and said that she didn't wish Britain to be in the single market, so we didn't need to spend more time talking about the indivisibility of the four freedoms. But there were plenty of other dimensions which we can talk about to her formal position. And then she formally triggered Article 50, so we have a timetable. So Britain will leave the EU by March 2019. And we've now called a British general election to add an extra dimension, which is going to take place on the 8th of June. And we can talk about the outcome of that and whether it matters. I mean, it obviously does matter, but how much it matters or in what way it might matter if people wish to. But briefly, from the sort of city's point of view and a wider economic point of view, I think it's easiest to see this in 3 stages. So let's talk quickly through each one. The first one is the formal process by which Britain leaves the EU. So by March 2019, I think we will take down the flag outside the European Parliament building, and the obvious institutional manifestations of membership will cease. So we will no longer have members of the European Parliament. We'll no longer have a commissioner, for example. I was going to say Britain won't go to the Council of Ministers meetings, but quite a lot of them now seem to be taking place without Britain. Anyway. And I think there are some quite big issues to be resolved by that March 2019 date in terms of the departure. The 2 most contentious ones, which are causing a lot of friction already, and if any of you have seen the front pages of today's British newspapers, they are, how do I put it, inflammatory, very dramatic. I mean, I think one of them is May declares war on Brussels, for example. It's pretty inflammatory. But there was this very controversial, it turned out to be controversial, dinner in London last week with Jean-Claude Juncker and Michel Barnier and Theresa May on the British side, where there was clearly, if you believe the report, some tension. And the EU Commission is now saying that they anticipate the size of the British exit fee for leaving the European Union to be something in the region of 100 billion euros. Now, nothing is ever completely certain in politics, but I would drop down dead if Theresa May paid 100 billion euros to the EU in order to leave the institution. I just think it's the most extraordinarily difficult proposition for a politician to explain to their electorate why that money shouldn't be spent on schools or hospitals. I mean, that's about 150 years' worth of British diplomacy, just to give us a sense of the scale of it. And this is an organisation that Britain is a net contributor to. So for a lot of British voters, it's quite hard to understand why, having paid a surplus into the budget for every year for decades, we owe the organisation lots of money. So I think there is some potential to try and find an accommodation on money. And there may be some obligations where Britain have signed up to budgets that stretch beyond the March 2019 deadline. That seems to be quite a reasonable area for sensible conversation. But these headline figures, maybe it's because I'm British, but from my point of view, they feel almost like they're designed to try and make the outcome less successful rather than more successful, because they are so out of what could plausibly be politically acceptable that you wonder whether there is a sort of a sub-motive to try and achieve a bad outcome. There's also an issue about the status of UK nationals in the EU, and because there are 3 times more of them EU nationals in the UK, is important as well. I think that will be resolved. There is no appetite in Britain for forcefully deporting people from the other EU 27 nation states. I haven't heard a single politician talk in those terms. The difficulty is what rights those people will enjoy, in some cases, the rest of their lives. You know, would a Swedish national living in Britain now be eligible for pension entitlements in 30 or 40 or 50 years' time? If they marry somebody in the future, will that person be allowed to come to live in Britain, even if they're a non-EU national? What would be their future eligibility for welfare payments? Were their children who aren't even been born yet to be eligible for child support payments? So the complication is in the detail, but I think it will all be resolved. Let's say that we get to the point, March 2019, that all of these have been agreed. There's a lot of confrontation, a lot of negative briefing in the media, but we have got some sort of agreement, and Britain leaves. I then talk to people across the EU about what the future relationship will look like. What will it be like in 5 years, 10 years? And I think there is quite a lot of optimism that we will end up having a reasonably mutually beneficial and high-level trading relationship. And it makes sense because Britain will be by far the biggest economy on the continent of Europe, not in the EU, and a big trading partner of the EU, and it makes sense for both sides for us to have a good working relationship. It makes no sense for the EU to have a formal trade agreement with South Korea, but not to have a formal trade agreement with the United Kingdom. So I talk to people, and I think people broadly do accept that we will have to try and put in place a specific deal. It will not just be a sort of enhanced Norway EEA offer. It will sort of be a third-party deal, and it will recognise the size and specific nature of the British economy. And I hope that that discussion need not be as difficult as some trade negotiations, because, of course, unlike most trade negotiations where you start with a huge divergence in terms of regulations and standards, and you spend years and years trying to work out how you can converge, with the relationship between the UK and the EU, you have complete alignment already on day one. We have all the same standards as you have in Sweden or in France or Germany. So the question is not how do you try and bring all the harmonisation. We have harmonisation. The question is how much the politicians wish to introduce an element of dysfunctionality for wider political purposes into what is already a functional relationship, and how you manage future divergence and who arbitrates over that. But that is no different from trade agreement the EU is seeking to put in place with, say, Japan, where there would have to be some mechanism for managing divergence in those types of agreements as well. And I get a sense that people believe this will all be quite complicated, but we will get to a reasonable point eventually, or at least it's in everyone's interest to get to a reasonable point eventually. What then causes quite a lot of nervousness in the city is, in a way, the middle stage, which is how we bridge the gap between March 2019 and the introduction of this new long-term relationship between the EU 27 and the UK. And at the moment, we don't know how long that bridge is, and we don't know where it's going to, which is not a bridge that most people would feel very comfortable about stepping onto. And this is the sort of transition period. And I hope that what we will manage to do, in addition to agreeing by March 2019 the terms of the UK departure, is have made substantial progress on what the future relationship will be. This is a point of contention as well at the moment, the degree to which these talks can happen in parallel. But if we reach March 2019 with no idea about where the bridge leads to, then we will be in a very difficult period, and that causes a lot of nervousness for businesses who feel, it was behind me before, but feel like a bit like sort of driving in the fog with a very limited sense of what's happening a bit down the road. And so if we can get to a position not where there is a final agreement, the position of the British Prime Minister is she would like a final agreement by that stage. I have not met anyone in the EU who believes that is likely to happen. But if we can build a sort of house, if you like, in terms of what a big building of what the future relationship will look like, that is architecturally recognisable to people, we can then spend maybe 2 years fitting out all of the rooms, but at least we know architecturally what it all looks like. And I think that should be plausible. I think that is in people's interest. So that when we leave, you can have, let's say, a 2-year period for implementing the fishing part of it, and the agricultural part of it, and the universities part of it, and the financial services part of it. And then you would get to, say, March 2021, and you would finish that transition period, and then you would adopt the full trade agreement that we could have been discussing then for 4 years by that period, if you include the implementation phase. And I think that was a motivation for Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, to call a general election in Britain. It's unlike Sweden, as I understand it, whereas if you have an early election, you still have to have the next election on the date it was originally scheduled for anyway. The clock is reset to zero in Britain, so our next election will now not be due until June 2022 at the latest, could be. And that allows her to have this difficult transition period from 2019 to 2021 without a British general election in the middle, which would have been particularly difficult, because I think that will be the period which will cause the most domestic political anxiety for her, potentially, because I think even though there is an appetite in the EU to put a special arrangement in place for Britain for the permanent relationship, there is very limited appetite for putting a special relationship in place for the transitional arrangements. And it is quite likely that some of the transitional arrangements will include Britain being subject to European Court of Justice or other EU arbitration, which, as you can imagine, for a country that's voted to leave the EU, feels an uncomfortable position to be in, or at least is politically controversial in many people, particularly in the Prime Minister's own party. But she may have managed to buy enough goodwill with her own politicians in her own party and have won a sufficiently big mandate at the general election this year in June 2017 that she has the authority to get through that period, especially if she doesn't have to have an election in the middle of it. Very quickly, before I finish, how does the city see all of these developments? There's nervousness about the uncertainty. A lot of them may talk in terms of sort of 18-month planning processes and the political decision-making running behind their planning process. So there is a big question about what will happen when Britain leaves in 2019. I think it is now widely expected, not least because the British Prime Minister has said it in terms, that Britain will not be in the single market. So for those businesses that need some presence in the single market in order to operate across the 27 member states and do not currently have a presence, then they are looking at options of whether they locate some people to Frankfurt or Dublin or Amsterdam or whatever it might be. And they say quite often that will take 18 months to make sure, just boring things, that the IT systems work, that we've got the office lease sorted out and everything else. So I think there will probably be some businesses making decisions this autumn about relocation. But I wouldn't exaggerate the scale of that process. I haven't heard businesses in London saying we are going to relocate our global head office from London to a city elsewhere in Europe. They may say, of the 8,000 people we have in London, we're now looking at moving 300 or 400 to a new site in Frankfurt or wherever it might be. And that's, of course, for the businesses that have quite a strong European focus. There's quite a lot of activity in the City of London that is global, that is concentrated on Asian markets, for example, where the relationship with the European Union is not central to the business model. But obviously for those businesses where it is, I think there is widely anticipated there will be some adjustment as a result of Britain leaving the single market, and they are planning for that. An advantage London has is that there is no consensus on where to move to, and London is of a much bigger scale, so I think it's quite likely that there will be some benefits for Dublin, there will be some benefits for Paris, but the European economy as a whole will keep London as its global financial centre. And I would argue that that is in the interest of people across Europe, that the natural adjustments are entirely reasonable and logical consequence of Brexit, but that the EU seeking to degrade London over and above those natural adjustments would be an act of self-harm by the EU, because it would be inflicting damage on Europe's global financial centre, which happens to be hosted by the United Kingdom, but which is an asset for Europe as a whole. Most people are anticipating something in the region, maybe 5% of the jobs leaving London. We'll see. I think it's a little bit, estimate your own figure a bit, because it's hard to know. Although what I always do say, and I'll conclude on this note, that the most important consideration for London is not to sort of measure whether it's 4% of the jobs or 5% of the jobs or 6% of the jobs. Obviously that matters to the individual who might or might not lose their job. But every day, today, in the City of London, quite a lot of people will lose their job. They may not know yet who they are, but they will. And quite a lot of people will get a phone call saying, you've got a new job or a promotion today. In other words, it's constantly churning. There's it's a big sort of evolutionary Darwinian organism, the City of London. Employs hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people. If you look at the City of London 30 years ago, most of the big companies no longer exist. If you look at the City of London today, there are something like 45,000 people working in fintech. How many people working in fintech in the City of London 10 years ago? Nobody. Or certainly 20 years ago. So I think it's a mistake if we get ourselves into a mindset of thinking that we reach an evolutionary end point in financial services provision in June 2016 when Britain voted to leave the European Union. And we measure our success by how much we can freeze for the rest of time the arrangements that we had in June 2016. Who's to know what the effects will be of, say, automation? You hear about HSBC moving some jobs potentially. But who's to say that HSBC would have the same number of jobs in 5 years or 10 years' time as they do today if Britain had voted to remain in the European Union? Seems likely they'd have fewer, or they'd be aligned differently, or in different places, or different people, or different skills required. So I think the task for the City of London is to retain its vitality and its indispensability, and to remember the key fundamentals, of which the relationship with the rest of Europe is clearly an important consideration, but it is not the only consideration. The chief executive of Barclays made a speech last week, which is interesting, where he said, in terms of the City of London's three big concerns, one of them is around market access, one of them is around making sure we have a good transitional arrangement, but the third is around so-called access to talent, that he thought possibly, although a lot of the focus is on the first two, that the most important of those three was the last one, the access to talent. That if Britain remains dynamic and entrepreneurial, and people want to come and work there, and create businesses there, and expand businesses there, that is the most important factor of all. And that is largely in the gift of the British government, or at least the debate that we're having within Britain. So we need to, at the same time as we try and negotiate a good outcome with the European Union, which is in the mutual interest of both sides, and particularly in try and have a good constructive relationship with free market, outward-looking trading nations which share a lot of Britain's sensibilities and disposition, like Sweden, that we also don't lose sight of what it is that we are offering globally and what makes us potentially attractive as a financial services hub in the first place. So I'll finish.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pehr. Let me be very honest, this is not an easy task. It's complicated and then I have my crude English, sort of in this eloquent speaking Brit. I feel sort of pressed down a bit. When the UK decided to leave, I felt devastated. It was a big sorrow that night, and a week after I felt depressed, and I was trying to make a similarity. I haven't had a divorce, but it's a bit like a friend of you, very close acquaintances, gets a divorce, or maybe if that didn't never happen to me, but if I was in 5th grade and I didn't have any girls, but if I had in 5th grade and she left me, I would feel like it's the end of the world, even though I think inside myself I would know it's not the end of the world. That's my feelings. So I think we need, and I would say that are the feelings of the Swedish people. We love the UK, we love London, and we are extremely sad that you are leaving. And but not only because of sort of emotional feelings, is that we're losing a close ally. I've been working, and I look at Johanna here, we've been working for a very long time in the Economic Financial Committee, and Britain was our closest friends. I sat next to John Cunliffe, the President and Deputy Governor, for 4 years, and sort of the liberal views we have in Sweden on the three markets, the product market, the financial market, and the labour market. We share that with the UK, and you have been very close with us, and we will now be weaker. Those ideas will be weaker in the European Union, and we will be more forced to the old-fashioned sort of French and German thinking on this, and it's not as clear-sighted. I worked quite a lot with the people around Gordon Brown on sort of making the three markets works be more liberal, and then trying to find bridges for people to find sort of to jump between different statuses. Those days are over, and I'm just sorry. What the UK did here was a gigantic, I don't know if you say that in English, but a gigantic shot in the foot. So I'm sorry. Sorry. But life goes on. Now we need to find some way forward. Now, what would be the Swedish position here? Now, my view is that the Swedish position should be a position where we support the UK. And I think we should support the UK at its fullest. So if the UK asks for something, I think the Swedish role to be said, yes, we support that. And I think the idea should be a bit like a banking crisis. Well, before you say that you're not going to support it, but when the shit hits the fan, then you support it. And the reason for that is not that I think that the Swedish position will prevail. The reason for it is that everybody else in the EU will try to push it the other way. I mean, if you talk with French people and we've talked with Germans, there are quite a lot of people in the EU that feel, good that they're leaving. Now we can sort of really build this house as we wanted to. I think that's the wrong position. So my advice to the Prime Minister of Sweden and all the ministers in the Council will be always support the UK. Not really because you're going to get it, but to tip the scale as much as you can. And if you remember all the principles, the further out you are, the more leverage you have. So that would be sort of the unique advice, or not unique, the advice to the Swedish government. That also demands something from the politics of the UK. Last time we met, and I'm happy you've changed tone a bit, because what happened before was that a lot of the speeches were a bit like, now the UK voters voted to leave. This is the interpretation of that. And so the UK voters, they wanted to stop immigration. They wanted to stop paying money to Brussels. They wanted to have the independence and the sole decision-making in the parliament. I think that's an important part, and you scale that away, which I think is good, because bluntly, the interpretation of the referendum is up to today's politicians. People in the UK voted to leave, nothing else. And maybe they didn't vote for that. I mean, it's difficult to see what people vote for in referendums because they tend to vote on a lot of different issues. But my point is that to make the political interpretation as you decide it yourself. And it is strange that some of the sort of interpretation has been very much coinciding with the conservative part of the Conservative Party. Which I think is bad. And I think here we need to find a win-win. And that idea, Sweden will do our very on the margin, the small thing we can do in the margin, pushing it on the one side, then the UK should be better. Now, yesterday when I was preparing my notes, I looked through my house to see what do I have in my house that's British. And what I found was a half bottle of Lafroig, is that what you say? I mean, the whiskey you buy on duty free and you never drink. Then I found HB sauce, House of Parliament sauce, in the fridge. I have a toaster, Dualit toaster, and I have books, Jane Austen and Richard Adams, just to give two examples. But nothing more. Honestly, if I look for French stuff in my refrigerator, there are tons of French stuff. If I look around, I see, but honestly, there are not much British in the whole house. And that is the problem for the UK. But you have one advantage, and that advantage is if I look around the house, most of the things there is probably some kind of an IPO or M&A or some kind of rights issue or thing like that behind it. Because if I look at my Electrolux refrigerator, well, they probably took some bonds and put on the UK market in order to finance the investment or to do something like that. So for the UK, the financial service sector is extremely important. And for us, being sort of, we don't buy that much of UK goods, but we want to use the market. So London is extremely important for the UK and also important for us. Now, what are the solutions? And I'm sorry, I don't sort of really know sort of the short term and the medium term and the long term. But I would say that there are two solutions to it. One is what I call the Norway Model. And the Norway Model is very simply, and I think Mr. Browne put it, that you take down the flag in Brussels and nothing else happens. That's what my best advice to you would be. Just take down the flag outside the parliament and keep everything like it is. But it probably won't happen. And honestly, I've been on those meetings where you see the Norwegians waiting outside the European Council and all the ministers run off. And then me, I was state secretary, I had to take the meetings with the poor Minister of Finance from Norway, who then wanted to meet with the European Council. It doesn't look pretty, and I'm afraid it won't happen. Or you could have sort of the really hard Brexit, and then you have to find something in between. I think that the way forward is, in these terms, is that you have two ways. Either you have what you call the passporting, and that is that you have a legal right, and what you do is that you accept that those are that have a passport right in the UK are allowed to work in other EU countries. Or you have what I'm not an expert on, but what you call equivalence. And the idea is that you have equivalent regimes, but the problem with the equivalence is that is up to the decision making of the Commission, and you can take away it within, 30 days or a month or something like that. So what I would do here is to find a deal here where you try to get equivalence, and you try to change the sort of the number of days that you can take that away to increase it up to, let's say, 6 months or a year or something like that. On the European side, what you need to do is you need to decide exactly what to do with surveillance. So now we have the ECB is surveilling all the banks. Either they directly supervise all the banks in the euro area, or indirectly they take the small banks through the sort of subsidiaries in the local banks. So that's the banks are taken care of. Then you need to take care of the rest. And I think that the best proposal I've seen out there is to give increased power to ESMA. ESMA is the sort of supervisory board that now looks on MiFID and MiFIR regulation, the financial markets, and you would give them increased oversight on CCPs and on accounting firms and things like that. And then what you could do then is to have a cooperation between the UK FSA, Bank of England, and ECB and ESMA. And you would have then equivalence. Now, the result would be a weaker UK. Probably all the decisions, the most important decisions, will be taken by the French and the Germans in a much broader and a much more aggressive way. But I think that's the best thing you can get. Because this will create problems. And the more you look into it, imagine yourself you have two regimes. And now we are standing on the same train station, and now they slowly depart. And when they depart, we will have problems. I just give you a few examples. Look at CCPs, central counterpart clearings. So what happened is that all those things, it's extremely complicated if you look at the contract in the CCP, and it boils down in the end to sort of common law. Now, what would happen if all the CCPs moved to France? Well, then it will end by, and now we have French law. And honestly, I do not know many people in Sweden that know sort of the French, sort of the nuts and bolts of French regulatory and French judicial courts. And you can see this at other things. What will happen with IPOs? Well, most IPOs are done in the language or in the laws of their own domicile when you put it out. But there are also some aspects that are linked to British law. What would happen if all the IPOs would sort of be taken place in Dublin? I do not know the difference between Irish law and UK law. What will happen if it's in Frankfurt? I have no clue about German bankruptcy laws. I have no clue about German litigations. And my point is that what will happen here is that in the end, something will go wrong. And that is what scares me. So my point is that I would say that I have 4 points. And the first is, out of Swedish interest, I would say, try to avoid and try to do everything you can to avoid a full-fledged financial crisis, because that could happen. You are playing with fire when you are doing things like this. It's so complicated that you need to do everything you can to avoid it. And the second thing is that what I would try to do is to keep the UK FSA and the Bank of England at the table as much as possible, because they are good people and they are thinking in a way that's good for countries like Sweden. The third thing is that what will happen is there will be dramatic push for Euro membership for us countries that are not a part of the Euro, but are a member of EU. We've always been able to lean on the UK because the UK had their British pound and we're outside. We will be, I think Sweden will be the big, not Poland, but they have sort of a path. But I think it will be dramatic push for the non-Euro countries to join the Euro, which I think will be bad. And then you have to do everything you can to sort of make the capital markets work well. I don't know who said this about Russia. There was a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside in enigma. Well, that's typical British eloquence. For me, this is very simple. This is complicated. And the more you read about it, the more you get into the detail, it's even more complicated. Something will go wrong somewhere, and it will have effects. So my basic advice, be nice. Be nice from Sweden, be nice from the UK, try to behave.
Wow. Can I respond to some of Jens's points?
Jens, don't you have any old Beatles and Rolling Stones records? I was shocked.
People don't have records anymore. I don't have records. You.
Marmite.
Yeah, of course. Jeremy, would you comment?
It's been, just briefly, because it'd be nice to have a conversation. Well, Jens, thank you very much, by the way. And don't worry, your English is fantastic. So most people in Sweden. But, yeah, I mean, I felt some sadness as well, and I felt a loss of idealism. And I felt particularly sad in terms of Britain's relationship with the countries which we have the most natural affinity with elsewhere in Europe, including Sweden. And I felt we were letting down quite a lot of those countries who had worked in partnership with us. And I suppose if I'm being grand about it, slightly looked to us for sort of like the sort of big brother in the family. And if I have a slight concern or criticism now, is I wish those countries would assert themselves more. If I had a bit of a challenge to people here in Sweden, I would say if Jean-Claude Juncker was coming to London and the only countries he consulted before he left were France and Germany, and perhaps because he's a Luxembourger, Luxembourg, and perhaps because he lives in Belgium, Belgium. Let's say he just talked to France, Germany, Luxembourg and Belgium. What would he be saying differently than if he'd listened to all of the EU27? Yeah, or put it this way, if it was an EU26, not an EU27, and Sweden wasn't in it, what would be the difference in his position? And my guess, if I'm being blunt about it, is not very much. And I think it does make a big difference. I think that Brexit makes a big difference for Sweden, but I think Brexit needs to be seen as part of a process about what the EU will look like after Brexit as well. And this sort of equilibrium you said. And I think there are quite a lot of countries in the European Union who do see an opportunity to construct a post-Brexit EU which is more federalist and more protectionist. And the countries that are sceptical about both of those instincts, if they do not assert themselves, they don't necessarily have to defend Britain's interest, but if they don't defend their own interest in terms of the negotiations with Britain, I think they will end up in an EU that is less to their liking after Brexit than they have today. And very, very quickly, the other point. Almost certainly, we can talk about British general election if you like, but almost as certain as you get in democratic politics, Theresa May will still be the Prime Minister of Britain after the 8th of June. The big change that will have happened domestically is the interpretation of Brexit that she has is open to quite a lot of challenge at the moment, because you could say, well, what's to say that your interpretation is any greater than my interpretation or anybody else's interpretation? Well, if she is elected as Prime Minister with an increased majority, then she will be able to say, well, I'll tell you what's to say my interpretation is better than yours. It's that I just won a general election based on that proposition. And I don't think it will be acceptable to not only this British government, but I think to the wider sort of psychology of the British for us to end up in a Norway-style arrangement. I mean, if I'm honest, I think if France had left the EU, I don't think the French would find it acceptable for them to be in that position either. I'm not sure that's uniquely due to a British attitude. And certainly the referendum is open to interpretation in Britain. But if we stay in a Norway-style EEA arrangement, we would have to accept complete freedom of movement. We would have to make large annual generic budget contributions into the EU. And we would be subject to the rulings of the European Court of Justice, whilst not being able to participate in any of the discussions, including on financial services. And I think it's hard to sell to the British electorate that Brexit means carrying on exactly the same on immigration, money and sovereignty, which I think a lot of people thought were the three things that they were voting on when they voted in the referendum. So the question is, how can we have a constructive relationship with the European Party, but from outside, as the British Prime Minister puts it, not one foot in and one foot out, but from outside? And I think on financial services, the pragmatic outcome is to try and construct some mechanism where the EU27 and the UK exist within one broad regulatory family, but the UK has some means by which it can participate in the family conversations. Now, if you're an absolutist with the EU27, you say, no, you can't, too bad, you voted to leave. You're outside the room. But I think that, as I say, the more pragmatic solution is to recognise that Britain has particular strengths in this area and can contribute to a constructive debate. And as a result, the British have some way of being in the room. Whether we have exactly the same status as everyone else, that seems to me is more flexible. But I think that is the best way to try and marry pragmatic considerations with the political reality in Britain and try and reflect as well the political reality in the EU27.
Okay. Questions, comments? Yes. We wait for the microphone. And if you could present yourself as well.
Hi. Andreas Wittgren, Swedbank. Just a question. You were talking about automation before. In sort of net terms, what do you think is going to be the biggest threat for jobs in London? Automation or Brexit?
Well, I don't know. And I suppose no one knows. But the point I was trying to make is, the point I did make, and I think everyone understood, is that there will be a lot of change in this sector in the next 5 or 10 years. And quite a lot of those changes will be attributed wrongly, in my view, or exclusively to Brexit when they ought not to be. It's a rapidly evolving sector. And I think sometimes there's a rather deterministic, this is a little bit sort of French as well, mindset within the EU that we have a set number of financial services jobs on the continent of Europe. And what we need to do is get round a table in Brussels and decide where they're all allocated. And actually, it's a much more vital, dynamic economic model than that. London is not the financial services centre of Europe because a committee in Brussels decided to make London the financial services centre of Europe. It's because, and there's lots of things we're not good at in Britain. So I don't want to stand in and say, aren't the British brilliant at everything? We're not. There's lots we can learn from others. But in this particular sector, there is an alignment of British strengths which has made London an essential global financial centre. And all I'm saying is that resisting change is not a formula for ongoing future success. And I think one of the things that has made us adaptable in a very positive way in London is a willingness to be constantly evolving and taking account of consumer preferences and change, rather than sort of clinging to what we think of as a sort of successful model in the past. And so it's important the psychology of the City of London retains that vitality.
I have Johanna. Could you just throw in a question which is a bit related? You quoted the CEO of Barclays with sort of 3 points, and the third one was that to make London successful in the long run, having access to a pool of talent is the important thing. And I very much agree. And I mean, I was teaching at the Stockholm School of Economics for years, and we saw students going to London, starting to work for Goldman Sachs or Merrill Lynch and there's been a lot of talent going to London, and London has been a very natural place for them to go to. Is there a risk that sort of it will not be as easy after Brexit for sort of newly graduated students from the Stockholm School of Economics to go to London and work?
Yes, I think that is a risk, and it's very much a hope of the City of London that we do not end up with that situation. Right. I mean, I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. People talk about the ecosystem, sort of jargon in the ecosystem of the City of London. But it's the central point I was making about this being a sort of massive organism that is sort of constantly evolving. And when people in the City of London say they have anxiety about the flow of talented people, they're not really talking about American chief executives who are paid millions of pounds a year. Ironically, Barclays' chief executive is an American who's paid £1 million a year, but I don't think he's even necessarily concerned about himself, because they sort of manage people in that position, and also numerically there aren't very many of them, despite the media impression. What they're talking about is a 25-year-old Estonian fintech entrepreneur who has got a proposition up and running in Tallinn, but there's only so far you can take a proposition in Tallinn, and they have come to London in order to try and access capital and meet like-minded, talented people so that they can try and get their fintech idea up onto a continental level or global level stage. And we have thousands of people like that, and the danger is that we end up designing an immigration system which disincentivizes that person to come to London. And it's quite hard to design an immigration system because at the point where he arrives, he may actually not meet many criteria. I mean, he may have no money at all or very little, but he has the capacity to be an entrepreneur and a success and employ people. And people worry a little bit in London about sort of cutting off some of the blood flow to part of the organism. Yeah. So, but final word is, if we don't have freedom of movement, and I think this is a resolved debate in Britain that we will not have the assumption of freedom of movement in the way that we do now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we will adopt an illiberal immigration system. I think the debate hasn't even started yet in Britain about, once we control our own immigration system, what will it actually be? And I think there is a tension between the sort of global Britain ambition, which is obviously shared by the City of London, that we will remain very open, and some people on the other end of the scale who envisage something more restrictive. So this is a big internal discussion for the City of London to make within Britain, is that it's vital for our interests and for that of London as a whole, as Europe's only real global hub city, that we remain a gathering point for talented people, not just from Europe, but from around the world.
Johanna Lübeck-Lilja, you have the microphone, great.
Yes.
And we have 10 more minutes for those of you who have questions, but sort of join. Yes, please.
You said my name. I'm from Nordea. 2 questions or points of discussion. You talked about the period on uncertainty, and also you talked about the priority being market access. Now, do you expect the terms of market access being part of the negotiating discussions now or the future trade agreement? Because if it's the latter, the period of uncertainty for all companies that do business in London will be longer.
Yeah.
So that's my first. Shall I take the other one?
Yes, please.
That's on the issue of the future relationship also with the passporting and the third country equivalents that you talked about, Jens. I think we need to realize that passporting will most likely be gone. I think it's a dream people in Sweden are talking about. And then you talked about, if I understood correctly, that the future needs to be market access in return for EU surveillance, be it by ESMA or the European Court of Justice. My view is, talking to people in the UK, that will be hard to swallow. So it'd be interesting to hear if you agree. And then in particular, of course, the discussion on the euro clearing that you brought up, Jens. And we see the Commission already rambling with a proposal coming out in June on this one, which is clearly a part of the negotiations. So 2 issues.
Shall I go first? I mean, very quickly, the ambition of the British government, which I think the City of London would share, is as much as possible that we have concurrent parallel conversations about the terms of the departure and about the future relationship. Now, the position of the EU seems to be, well, we want to make some progress on the terms of departure before we get onto the future relationship. Okay, but people also in the EU spend their whole time telling me and everybody else who wants to listen that this is all very complicated and will take a very long time. And if that's true, it seems a good idea to start sooner rather than later. And I think they're also linked. People quite often in the EU talk about this as a divorce. And I think it's quite hard to say to the British population that we require an upfront maintenance payments for the children, but we're not willing to give you any undertakings at all about whether you'll ever get to see the children. I mean, I think there's a, if you like, there's a, you know, there is inevitably a bit of a linkage as well. But I think mainly it doesn't have to be tomorrow. But in the next few months, it would be good if we could start to have some constructive conversations about the future relationship, because the sooner we start, the sooner we might be able to get that building I was talking about, and then we get greater certainty on the bridging arrangements. But secondly, I agree with you, and I think most people accept now in City of London on passporting that passporting is a manifestation of single market membership. And if we're not in the single market, people will not be able to get the passport in London. And I think the businesses are planning, by and large, on that assumption. And if it ends up not being that way, that will be a happy bonus for them, but they are looking at it in those terms. I also agree with your wider observations, and this is where I think Jens's solutions will prove to be politically unacceptable for the British. I mean, equivalence is we are equivalent with whatever the EU deems to be the rules at the time, and the EU can withdraw them at 30 days' notice. And I think that people in Britain will feel that they want some common set of agreed rules and an ability to arbitrate over those rules between us, rather, you know, in the same way as when we have a trade agreement between the EU and South Korea. It doesn't require the South Koreans to be subject to EU law in domestic South Korean law. You have some disputes resolution between the two parties. Can't imagine Trump accepting a version of TTIP where the EU tells the Americans what to do. So people in London talk a bit about whether the possibility is mutual recognition as distinct from equivalence, where we decide global rules, and Britain's a G20 country, has the ability to directly contribute to a lot of those conversations. And we then look at how they can be interpreted and implemented within the European context. And the British are happy and indicate that they're happy to, as I put it, sit within that broad European family. In other words, we're not looking to aggressively compete on regulation with the EU. We're looking to be complementary with the EU on regulation. But we then hope that we can have a constructive conversation through some new formal mechanism on how that can be done and how any divergence can be managed. The analogy I sometimes use is like a driving license, where if a Swedish person comes to London, they can hire a car and drive it, not because your driving test is identical to the driving test in Britain, but because it is similar enough that we deem you to be safe to drive a car on British roads. Even though you drive on the wrong side of the road, and vice versa. You know, I could hire a car here on the basis that you think that there's a mutual recognition of the driving standards in the UK. It's not an exact analogy, but you understand the point I'm making. And I think that is where people in the British debate would like to end up. But I think there are quite a lot of people in the Brussels side who feel that this is a big concession and would set an unhappy precedent of countries being able to have a sort of coterminous relationship with the European Union without being in it.
Yes. Mike is coming.
Thanks. Looked some very interesting discussion. I mean, just a sort of brief reflection on the interpretation of the Brexit result. I mean, I don't entirely accept that it was inevitable that we had to interpret, or the result had to be interpreted in terms. Sorry about it, Frank Farrell from the Swedish National Debt Office. I should have introduced myself first. I don't accept that it was entirely inevitable that the government had to interpret the result of the referendum as being we needed to exit the customs union and the single market. I mean, one of the bizarre contradictions is that when you ask people in opinion polls what they want from Brexit, they very often say we want control over immigration at the same time as we also want to have the same trading relationship with the EU that we already have at the moment. The problem is that these two positions are fundamentally irreconcilable. And when you ask people how much they're willing to pay to get control over immigration, well, actually the discussion becomes rather different. Because it appears that there isn't quite the same willingness to make economic sacrifices to gain some of the sovereignty benefits of exit. That said, I accept we are where we are. The government has decided to interpret the exit vote as being a hard Brexit, so the best outcome we can hope for is a hard Brexit. However, there is clearly a non-negligible risk of a train crash Brexit. And I suppose my question is, could you let us know what sort of preparations are being made in the city for, this sort of eventuality where Britain tumbles out in 2 years' time without any sort of agreement on the future relationship or a transitional phase?
You have 2 minutes to answer that little question.
I was in Scotland last week. Well, look, this is all political interpretation a bit. I mean, it is true, and some British politicians say this, that why can't you say, well, we'll leave the European Union if it means, we won't have MEPs and we won't have a commissioner, but we will carry on in the single market. We will be in some Norway-style arrangement, and we're happy to pay large amounts of money into the EU budget, and we're happy to accept freedom of movement, and we're happy to be subject to ECJ rulings, and we're happy to be excluded from all of the meetings which decide all of the rules that we'll be subject to, is possible interpretation. It's not Theresa May's interpretation, and I think it is quite a difficult interpretation. I'm not saying you can't argue that if you're in a debating society, and not just a debating society. I hear Nicola Sturgeon or Nick Clegg, who was our recent Deputy Prime Minister, make essentially that point. We will see, but Theresa May's view is that is not a faithful interpretation of the mandate of the referendum. And I personally have some sympathy with that view. I think quite a lot of... I accept, it's like an election where most people want lower taxes, but they want far more money spent on health and education and police. And it's always, I can say this with first-hand experience of politician, this is a difficult balance to satisfy. And it is true that there are conflicting expectations in the referendum in Britain, but I think it is quite difficult to say that we will leave the institutions but not leave the sort of, if you like, the sort of wider sort of set of relationships that the EEA membership entail. And in a way, you could say Theresa May has just had the courtesy of taking Angela Merkel at her word. I mean, she said you can't be in the single market unless you accept the four freedoms, and so rather than having a big argument about it, we said, okay, we accept it. The question then now is whether we have some negotiated agreement along those lines, or whether we just end up with no negotiated agreement at all. I still think that it's probably more likely we'll have a negotiated agreement, but the last week has not filled people with optimism who take that view. And I'll finish in a way with something I said already, which is that I think that the likelihood of a constructive, mutually beneficial outcome, as in so much as that can be achieved given where we are today, will be considerably enhanced if countries like Sweden take a more active role in the process. I think if the discussions are between the Brussels establishment, who tend to have a sort of quite intransigent view about the necessity of the institutional supremacy of the EU, and a emboldened UK Prime Minister, the scope for conflict is greater than something which is more multi-dimensional and a bit more subtle and has a little bit more give. And that involves, I think, member states playing an active role, and not just the normal core Treaty of Rome ones, but the countries which quite often, in terms of their cultural behaviour, are a bit reticent, but share a lot, in my view, of good instincts with the British. And so I am talking about the Irish and the Dutch and the Scandinavians and some others. And you are the leading country in this part of Europe. And so, as I say, the more Sweden is involved, I think the more likely it is we will have a happy outcome.
Jens,
So
made this
brief.
signal.
First, interpretation, that's politics. And my advice would be put the country before the party. And so far, Prime Minister has not done that. Second point is, yes, Mr. Minister, or former Minister, that's follow up my own advice. We will try to do what we can, and I'm happy to see that the Minister of Finance in Sweden, Magdalena Andersson, has done that. She's been very supportive of it. Third, I think equivalence is the best you will get. And I would hope that the equivalence, when you have prolonged periods and some kind of a house, as you put it, where the UK FSA and the Bank of England sit together with people from ESMA and the ECB, is the best we can get. And finally, I'm sorry to say, I don't see any British cars out there. Only German and French and some Swedish cars. Thank you.
Although, actually, interestingly, more cars are made in Britain now than at any point in history. Just make lots of Japanese cars and lots. No, but this is the essence of a globally interconnected modern economy. We don't massively subsidise French equivalent car manufacturers to make cars that people don't want to buy because they're being produced at prices they don't want to pay. But my view is that that's more likely to do. Anyway.
Jeremy, thank you. And
Thank
Jens,
you.
we're running out of time. Thank you very much.
No.